Here we are at episode 21, breaking down the basics. This is the long form content where we'll show you some examples. Will pop up on the screen next to me. So we were talking about likelihood determination. And the first thing I want to mention is we talked about picking likelihood ranges that meet what you're doing at your site. So as you can see in the matrix that's popping up next to me about likelihood, this is done in factors of 10. And as you can see in the lower ranges, it's once a year, and then 1 in 10 and 1 in 100 is kind of that as it goes up, right? So the key point you want to look at is you want to make sure the operations that you're doing are corresponding to these points, right? So if you only do an operation once every 5 years and you set it and forget it, these numbers may not make a lot of sense to you. Or like I've mentioned in the past, between this 1 in 10 and 1 in 100, if you're seeing probability failures and actually seeing incidents happen, you may want to add some of those in here and use that as kind of a different layer of protection, right? The math is going to kind of work out a little different, but you can set your target risk at a different target risk. For those of you who do LOPA know what I'm talking about. For those of you just doing PHAs, basically you can come up with the likelihood levels that you see fit and what you think is acceptable for your plan. So here's an example of just how that could look, and that might work for you, or you may want to do something more intricate. So now looking at number 2, point we talked about earlier was human error, and how do you factor in human error when you're looking at likelihood in the PHA, right? So as you can see, I have here an excerpt from the table. We've got a likelihood of 3 and a likelihood of 2. What's the difference? And that difference is a statement of saying we do this operation frequent or infrequently, right? So this is just a quick example to say we only do something during turnaround or we do something every day. That may have a different frequency built in. Now, the thing you want to make sure, depending on your method and depending on if you use modifiers in your PHA or your LOPA, you don't then want to use a time modifier later if you're taking that time modifier in the original likelihood or the initiating event likelihood or the base likelihood, some of what we call it, okay? So thirdly, we're talking about loops. You can see here on the screen 2 different types of loops. If we look at loop number 3, you can see all connected in here, the control, the transmitter, the valve, the element. So you want to, as I mentioned in the short form, take what is the weakest link of these and use that as your point of reference for likelihood, okay? So if the transmitter is the lowest, which a lot of times it is, then you want to use the transmitter probability and you would just call it out as the loop failure probability or loop malfunction. That can be from a high or a low perspective, okay? Sometimes this conversation is a little more difficult for people to understand, so you may want to split it up. Just know that some safeguards you can use for a valve failure, you won't be able to use for a transmitter failure or controller failure, and that's kind of why we covered all in one to kind of nip it in the bud and cover everything all together. So here's a couple examples just to look through when you're talking about likelihood. Obviously, there's tons more factors of likelihood, and there's a bunch of other items that can be initiating events, right, to look at. We talked about that earlier in the causes. For more content on keeping you safe, you can take a look at our website. We have more long-form videos coming up.